Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines.
The war with Iran enters its fifth day. Welcome to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lines. Joe Matthew is off today as Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says this conflict is only getting started. We'll have analysis from former U.S. CENTCOM Commander General Frank McKenzie this hour. And we'll also hear from the former Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who sat down with Bloomberg's David Gura about whether there's any path forward for diplomacy. And of course, the Middle East is not the only thing we have to follow today. There will be a meeting at the White House this afternoon with big tech executives over energy costs and how to protect consumers from rising electricity costs over AI. We're going to have an Amazon executive join this hour as well. Sullivan, Amazon's Vice President of Worldwide Economic Development Policy, will be with us in just moments. Here in Washington, we are, of course, monitoring all of the developments from all different facets of the administration when it comes to the ongoing war with Iran and the messaging around it. We are expecting the White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt to speak with the media and answer questions any minute now. That briefing was scheduled to begin at 1 p.m. Eastern time, and we'll, of course, bring you any headlines from it. But we also received a briefing earlier today from the highest-ranking members of the military. The Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman General Dan Kane joined once again the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth in briefing the media and providing an update on this conflict, which in the words of Secretary Hegseth is only just beginning. He suggests that we are not anywhere near the end to these military operations, as he also pointed to the military's accomplishments, in his view, in eradicating some of Iran's military capability, including using a torpedo from a U.S. submarine for the first time since World War II to sink an Iranian warship off the coast of Sri Lanka. So clearly combat operations are still going. The question is there any path forward still for potential diplomacy? The New York Times, of course, reported this morning that Iranian operatives, the day after the U.S. began these strikes, did reach out for potential talks, though Iran is now pushing back against this idea, suggesting that that reporting was false and psychological warfare. So if Iran is suggesting it's not interested to talk, at least in terms of what it's pushing out through the media, and President Trump says the time to talk is over, what hope is there of talking? That's something that David Gura, my colleague here at Bloomberg and, of course, co-host of Bloomberg This Weekend, had the chance to speak with the former U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken about earlier today. And David's joining me now for more on what they talked about. So, David, what did Secretary Blinken tell you?
You know, he's an optimist, of course, and somebody who is a true believer in the utility of diplomacy. And I asked him explicitly during that conversation, did he think there's still room for diplomatic negotiations to talk, for these two sides to get together? And he said, yes, there is. We talked about what a potential off-ramp might be as well. And he said he's thinking about two things: munitions and markets, focusing on markets in particular. He does think that what we've seen in the oil market and the stock market is something that could motivate the president to think about this timetable more deeply and more carefully. Munitions-wise, he suggests that maybe the U.S. and Israel might think about how this is widened and think about the constraints they might have in terms of fighting what the Iranians are doing here. Look, you talked about the briefings that lawmakers have gotten here in recent days. We've heard from the president, we've heard from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, we've heard from the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense. I asked Secretary Blinken if, from all of that, he has a clear understanding of what this administration's objectives are, and this is what he had to say.
Well, look, the case keeps shifting, but the first thing to say is this, from my perspective. Once our men and women in uniform are engaged in an operation or in a war, my first thought is for their safety and for their success, irrespective of what I think about how we got there or even where this is going. So that's primarily what I'm thinking of. But having said that, we've heard a number of shifting rationales. But I think it's important to take into account that we've got to be able to hold multiple truths in our head at the same time. Is it a good thing that this Ayatollah is gone? Yes. Terrible tyrant. Is it a good thing, potentially at least, that Iran's nuclear program is, I guess, re-obliterated, because apparently it was obliterated last June, but maybe not so much because they had to re-obliterate it, or its missile program diminished, or its Navy sunk? Yes. But to do that and to take on the extraordinary risks that go with it without having made the case with the American people, with citing imminent threats that apparently didn't exist, I think that's problematic. And the chances of unintended consequences taking hold in any situation like this are very real, very serious for our partners and allies in the region and for ourselves, and of course for the Iranian people. I think a big question that everyone has is, okay, have we done regime change in Iran or just Ayatollah change, which is the way it looks right now?
You brought up the argument that there was an imminent threat. In years past, you'd warned that there were a matter of weeks before Iran could develop fissile uranium. Is that an argument that's persuasive to you, so much as that's been made by the administration, that there was an imminent threat?
It's an ironic argument in a number of ways. First, as I said, they claim to have obliterated the nuclear fissile material program back in June. And now we're told, actually, no, we didn't. And a number of us warned at the time that one of the reasons why military action against the nuclear program might not do the trick is that the Iranians were likely to start to rebuild, maybe rebuild deeper underground, where we couldn't get at it. Whether that was happening or to what extent, I don't know, because I'm not privy to that information, but at least that seems to be part of the rationale. The deeper irony, of course, is that we never should have been in this position insofar as the agreement that President Obama reached, the Iran nuclear deal, the so-called JCPOA, put Iran's nuclear program in a box. It made sure that Iran could not produce the fissile material needed for a nuclear weapon in less than a year. And so if they chose to break out of the box and go for that, we'd see it, and we'd have plenty of time to be able to do something about it. President Trump tore up that agreement, said he'd replace it with something better. He never did, and that's the road that we then wound up on that led to, in some ways, to where we are today with Iran, yes, dramatically advancing its production of fissile material so that breakout time moved from 1 year to a couple of weeks. But you don't only need fissile material, you actually need a weapon, too. And I think, as has been publicly reported, our intelligence agencies and others, the IAEA, continue to conclude that Iran has not made a decision to actually weaponize. If and when they do, or if and when they did, most estimates had that timeline at a couple of years. There are different kinds of weapons, less sophisticated ones you could build on a quicker timeline. But the bottom line is that on the nuclear side, there was no imminent threat. There was, though, the fact that, yes, in terms of fissile material production, they'd gone from the Obama deal, more than a year, to a few weeks.
You know, it's interesting. I asked the secretary about how he feels about the negotiations that took place during the Biden administration. So President Biden came into office, and there was an effort to reanimate the JCPOA to try to get Iranians to agree to it once again. Those talks fell apart in 2022, and I asked the secretary, does he now think that perhaps they were trying to go for perfection instead of something that was a little more reduced? In effect, go for perfection is the enemy of the good. He said he does have some regrets about that, but fundamentally, he still pins this on the fact that the Trump administration, Kayleigh, pulled out of that deal back in the first term, and this is the legacy of the decision to do that.
Well, and I wonder, David, if he had any thoughts for you on the composition of the Trump administration and what they're doing here, both his successor, the now Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, but also those who are charged with the diplomatic efforts here who are not career diplomats like Antony Blinken, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner were the one leading these talks as the president's envoys. Did he share with you thoughts on that?
Yeah, he didn't want to criticize them directly. And he said what was probably missing the most here, and again, he said he didn't know the full details of this, was having the full apparatus of the State Department in those negotiations. In other words, having the technical experts who could come to the table when Steve Witkoff was there with Jared Kushner sitting across from Iranian diplomats. And he made what I think is a very salient point here. That is, Iran has a core of very highly trained and experienced diplomats who've been at this for many years. We remember Javad Zarif, for instance, who handled the deal during the first during the Obama administration. These are folks who know what they're doing and are experienced professional diplomats. Of course, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are not. So he didn't criticize them per se. He said that he assumed that they were operating in good faith, as he assumed the Iranians were operating in good faith here, but did note the fact that there was an inherent imbalance in the fact that there were trained diplomats on one side, and there are those who have not done this by practice or professional practice over the course of their careers.
And David, finally, when we consider the conversations you were having on Bloomberg this past weekend, and the ones that you may still have yet to have on Bloomberg this coming weekend, knowing that all signs from this administration are we will still be actively at war with Iran, these combat operations will continue. If in the absence of diplomacy, when we consider the timeline here and the military aspect of this, did Antony Blinken share with you any concerns about the idea that we could get drawn into a quote unquote forever war, as President Trump talks about? We have the munitions to carry this on forever if we so choose.
I asked him if he fears that there is a point at which you're going to need to put U.S. boots on the ground. He said that's not a necessary thing. There's no sense that has to happen here. But like a lot of folks I talked to on the show in the days since, he has been apprehensive about how this is widening and how that's likely to attenuate the timetable here. It's certainly something that he's very concerned about. And we talked a bit about parallels to what's happening. And he brought up Syria. He brought up Libya as well, countries that were kind of roiled by civil war when their leaders were taken out. So those are very sobering examples of what's to come here. And I'll just say one thing lastly, and folks can listen to the full interview on the Big Take podcast this afternoon. Something that he mentioned a number of times back when he was Secretary of State is that if this were to happen, if there were to be some leadership shift in Iran, the regime could take the uranium that it had processed and spread it across the country, in effect, hiding it. At a moment where there is so much chaos and uncertainty about what's going to become of this country, knowing that much nuclear material is, again, scattered about the country is something that should be deeply worrying, he thinks, to those who are watching all of this unfold.
All right, Bloomberg's David Gura, co-host of Bloomberg This Weekend. Thank you so much. An important conversation with the former Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. You can, of course, hear more of that in full on the Big Take podcast. But I want to turn back now here on Balance of Power to our political panel as we consider the political implications of this ongoing conflict with Iran and what role, if any, Congress is going to end up playing with war powers votes set to take place over the coming days in the Senate this afternoon, though it is expected to fail. Jeanne Zaino is with me, Democracy Visiting Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center and Bloomberg Politics contributor, our Democratic analyst, and Maura Gillespie, BlueStack Strategies founder and Republican strategist. Jeanne, to begin with you on this war powers vote, which of course is being pushed by Democratic Senator Tim Kaine, all signs are that there will be no Republican support for this realistically, or at least not adequate support to get this over the threshold it needs to actually pass the Senate. How significant as a signal, as a symbol, though, could this vote still be if it clearly shows that it's still just Democrats on one side and Republicans in large part on the other? What's the point?
It is important. It is significant. And all of these senators need to look back at how the votes on the Iraq war, for instance, that we all remember, came back and really had an impact on their careers going forward. You have to think very, very seriously about this. And I was struck yesterday after the briefing that they got to hear people like Senator Richard Blumenthal from Connecticut say, we may be putting boots on the ground. He described himself as more fearful than ever. And also, Senator Warren came out and said, if you had listened to what I listened to, essentially, you are right to be worried. They don't have a plan and they don't have an end strategy. And so I think as senators hear from the administration, this is an important vote for them to be put on record because their constituents, as we enter the midterms, have a right to know where they stand on what is perhaps the most significant foreign policy decision by this president, certainly, but by any president in the 21st century.
Well, so Maura, do you see a point at which a line is crossed, even for Republicans who by and large want to stand with the president on his decisions? If we do see ground troops going in, do you think that could be something of a tone shift in terms of what we're hearing from Capitol Hill on whether or not congressional authorization is needed?
For members to stay in line with the president between calling it war and then not calling it war and not wanting to call it war, I think that from the start of this, really, the White House has not given a good messaging tactic for Republicans to reiterate because they themselves don't seem to know what's going on. I think the lack of severity of the situation and not being serious with not only the why, but what the goal is, and being clear-eyed about that and consistent has been a downfall for the administration and will be a downfall for members of Congress who are looking to decide, where do they stake their legacy? Do they stake it with the Trump administration and kind of hope that it all pans out? Or do they decide what is best for not only the future of the country, but this act, right, and the powers that you're giving to the president long term, not just right now, but for generations to come? And I do think that that's something that members should be thinking through. But to stay with the president just for the sake of it, I don't know if that's a great long-term strategy.
Well, there's also the question as to whether or not the president is going to ask Congress not for permission to continue military operations, but instead for more money to carry them out. This is something we got into last night on Balance of Power with Republican Senator Mike Rounds.
We do know that we've still got munitions available to us, but anytime you expend the munitions, you want to make sure that you're in a position to replace those munitions as quickly as possible. And so if in the middle of this process over the next several weeks, they decide that they're going to ask for a supplemental, I most certainly would consider it, or as a part of the appropriations process. I think the president's indicated he'd like to go up about $500 billion in additional expenditures for the next coming year.
He also suggested to us that even budget reconciliation could be an option if this needed to be done on partisan lines, Jeanne. But could you see a scenario in which there actually could be Democratic support for this if it is money that is needed to replenish our stockpiles in order to provide for security, or even money that's needed to get Americans still stranded in the Middle East out?
I think obviously there would be support to get Americans stranded out, but I would be stunned if Democrats and, quite frankly, Republicans were willing to appropriate more money for this without any clarity on why we are there, what is the end game, and for how long. That would be stunning to me. At a time when Americans are suffering higher oil prices, higher gas prices, higher grocery prices, the list goes on and on. They elect a president who says he's going to focus on making their lives more affordable. And yet we are now in a war, and we are now in a war that is costing, by some estimates, upwards of $780 million a day. And that's probably on the low side. That we would be appropriating even more money to that would be stunning to me in this environment. And at the very least, the administration owes it to the Congress and the American people to be very clear on what the point is.
All right, Jeanne, Sheehan, Zaino, and Maura, Gillespie, our political panel today. Thank you so much. More Balance of Power is ahead right here on Bloomberg. Meantime, here in Washington, we are watching the White House as we pay attention to developments on a number of different fronts. Just a few hours from now at the White House, we are expecting to see tech executives getting ready to sign a pledge over energy costs for the AI hyperscalers in order to help insulate consumers from those rising electricity costs. We're going to have more on that in just a moment. But of course, the White House also very much is focused on what is now day 5 of the armed conflict with Iran. The White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, is briefing the media as we speak, talking about Operation Epic Fury, as it has been dubbed, being a resounding success, reiterating the goal is to destroy Iran's ballistic missiles, which is similar language, of course, to what we have heard repeatedly from administration officials, including from President Trump, both verbally and on Truth Social. But there's something else that just crossed Truth Social from President Trump I want to call attention to as well, and that is the president weighing in on the results of the Republican Senate primary in Texas yesterday. Yes, yesterday was a primary day amid all of this, and we are heading to a runoff. Neither Attorney General in Texas, Ken Paxton, or incumbent Republican Senator John Cornyn was able to secure 50% of the vote in the primary, so they will have to continue this race until May, knowing neither of them, at least to this point, has been endorsed by President Trump. But the president now says on Truth Social that he will be making an endorsement soon and will be asking the candidate that he doesn't endorse to immediately drop out of the race. The Atlantic reporting that the president is expected to endorse John Cornyn, though Bloomberg has not matched that. But we want to turn now to Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, who is live at the White House for us on this and the other bits of news. So, Tyler, obviously the Trump endorsement in this race has been long sought, long pushed for by establishment Republicans. I guess it's coming.
Yeah, Kaylee, I mean, you really hit the headline there. It's pretty significant that President Trump says that he will weigh in on this race because you'll recall he was just in Texas last week ahead of the primary and did not make what would have been a critical endorsement, as we have consistently seen Trump-backed candidates in the Republican primary yesterday cruise to victory. But instead, in this closely watched race, we had that third candidate, Wesley Hunt, who ended up taking some of those votes so that neither candidate was able to get to the majority and then ultimately clinch the nomination. So as you mentioned, now headed to the runoff, it does appear, according to reporting, that President Trump could be weighing an endorsement for the incumbent, Senator John Cornyn, a 4-term senator who has a massive fundraising advantage that ultimately helped him move ahead in the polls, but not quite enough to clinch that nomination. But whoever does win this is going to go up against Telerico, who ended up, the Democratic nominee, who ended up ousting Jasmine Crockett. But I have one statistic to read you here because it's going to be a tough race come November. A Democrat hasn't won a statewide office in Texas for more than 3 decades. So it's definitely going to be one to watch, but it is so significant that given that stat, we are putting so much emphasis on this one race.
All right, Tyler, I do also want to address why it is that you are standing outside in the rain at the White House. You are watching and waiting for tech executives who are expected to be there this afternoon to talk about the so-called ratepayer protection plan, basically insulate American electricity consumers from the costs of hyperscalers investing in AI. Tell us more about what to expect this afternoon.
Well, we're starting to see some people arrive here. We're watching very closely because President Trump is set to convene some tech executives to try to... Looks like we have one that went in. No comment there. But President Trump is essentially trying to get these big tech companies to sign on to pledges so that they will pay their way when it comes to electricity related to data centers. As you well know, this is part of a bid to offset that burden from American consumers as affordability remains the top concern for voters. The thing is, Kaylee, these pledges aren't expected to be binding. There's no real enforcement mechanism here. So there has been some questions raised about how much teeth these pledges really will have. But I can say that senior administration officials have briefed us reporters and said that they feel that a formal public pledge from these companies could help offset some of those anxieties. We're expecting companies like Meta, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, OpenAI, Elon Musk's XAI to all be in attendance today. So something to watch for as President Trump convenes this roundtable.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live on the scene at the White House with her head on a swivel. As always, thank you so much. And we want to have more on what Amazon is doing in AWS when it comes to this ratepayer pledge, but also the wider investments Amazon is making into the U.S. in particular. As I'm joined now in studio by Holly Sullivan. She's Amazon's Vice President of Worldwide Economic Development Policy, and she's here with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. Holly, thank you so much for being here. I know that you yourself will not be at the White House this afternoon. The CEO of AWS will be. But can you just speak broadly about the relationship that Amazon has with this administration, with the White House on efforts like this and others?
Yeah, this is an important policy issue, so we're really excited for the administration to take a lead on this and happy to be participating in the conversation and the partnership today. This is one of many policy issues that we're focused on at the company, and we're going to continue to work with this administration, all members of Congress, just as we have with previous administrations.
Well, and of course, this administration in particular has touted frequently how much investment it sees itself drawing into the United States and that it wants to encourage via its policies. And you are making some news on that today, and we're bringing this to you for the first time here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Amazon last year, 2025, invested a record $340 billion in U.S. infrastructure in jobs. How much of that is directly due to the policies of this administration?
Well, let me back up. So $340 billion in 2025, which is a 20% increase from our 2024 investment. But if you go back to 2010, we've invested $1.8 trillion in the United States in infrastructure, employee compensation. And so this is part of what we do as a company, as we're always trying to deliver for our customers and also create those innovations and those efficiencies for our customers.
Well, and talk to us about where this money is really targeting and if we should expect it to be driven into the same kind of sectors and areas moving forward in 2026 and beyond.
The investment will be not only in data centers, cloud infrastructure, AI, but also in our fulfillment network. And one of the parts about this, and I think a fun fact, is in the last 5 years, 2 out of 5 jobs that we've created have been in communities of less than 50,000 people. So it really speaks to our expansion, our rural delivery network also, which is a $4 billion expansion that we'll be doing by the end of this year.
Well, so when you talk about job creation, I am curious about this aspect of it, knowing that, and I'm sure this isn't news to you, in the last few weeks, we've seen quite a bit of frenzy around the idea that AI is going to come and displace a lot of people. It's going to get rid of a lot of jobs, even white collar ones. How are you thinking about whether this is net creating new opportunities versus displacing or moving jobs around from things that can be automated and turned to AI into other areas?
I think we're in a unique position because Amazon's not only an innovator, innovator of AI. We're also a deployer and a utilizer of AI. So you can use it in all different sectors of our businesses, whether it be around employee safety. But I'll go back to that delivery network. So one of the tools that we can use in AI is ensuring that we can deliver for our customers, understanding what the demands are in different parts of the country, working on how we can deliver that package more reliable and consistent and faster speeds for our customers.
Well, and so when we consider the jobs that are being added and the people who are coming to Amazon perhaps from other places, I guess to get back to the question of, is this net more jobs in the U.S. economy? Do you see that as being the case? You're adding new positions via or instead of just taking someone from, say, another shipper like UPS or something and bringing them over to Amazon?
There are net new positions. So in the last 5 years, we've created 500,000 jobs in the U.S. And so while we're always looking at how we innovate for those customers, we're also, growing in different new business lines too. We have our LEO satellites, drone delivery. Again, going back to that innovation. So yes, there'll be net new jobs.
And do you think that pace of job creation is going to be sustainable in the age of AI? I feel like this is the question everyone is contending with.
I don't have a crystal ball, but I can say
none of us
yes.
do, unfortunately.
None of us do. But we've consistently, I'll go back to that 500,000 jobs. And, AI is not new in the last, year or two. So if you kind of look back at the history of the job creation that we've had, we're going to continue to add jobs.
Well, do you think where you will be adding those jobs is going to be changing in this kind of new era as we see it moving exponentially? Because you're absolutely right, this isn't new, but it is moving very quickly, the speed of it.
It is moving very quickly, and we've added a lot of jobs in that AI and that data center infrastructure, but we've also equally added those jobs in our delivery fulfillment center and our corporate offices around the globe.
Well, and when we think about some of those physical jobs that may not be so easily displaced by technology or robots or LLM, that kind of thing, obviously there are concerns about workplace safety. Amazon has repeatedly said it is committing to that. Regulators don't always necessarily agree with the company, though, on that aspect. What do you think is causing that disconnect?
Sure, there's a true disconnect. I think it's also about how we're telling our story, and I think that's important. So in the last 2 years, we've invested $2 billion in our employee safety. Some of that is AI, some of it's robotics, and so we're going to continue to look at those innovations, but the safety of our employees is our number one priority.
So when we think about state laws, for example, that have targeted specifically use of productivity quotas, things of that nature, do you see that there is justification for having that, or is the company able to address that without state and other governments getting involved?
One of the new innovations that we actually have, it's not so new, but been around for a couple of years now, employees actually can look on their own personal devices and look at their productivity. So they have control over what's being reported, and we truly believe that relationship between manager, site lead, and our employees is the best.
And finally, we just have a minute left here, Holly. I don't want to put you in a bad position, but we are obviously having this conversation in the context of what is now a hot war in the Middle East. We have seen AWS and data centers be either targeted or collateral damage, essentially, in this conflict. How are you thinking about the potential longer-term implications, both for physical infrastructure, but also perhaps economically?
I think first, obviously the safety of our employees in the Middle East is our priority and will continue to be our priority. And, ensuring that we can serve our customers also is going to be important. So we're going to continue to monitor and hope to, partner with this administration on how we can do that.
All right, we're all monitoring it, and it is obviously a fast-moving situation. Holly Sullivan, thank you so much. She is Amazon's Executive Vice President of Worldwide Economic Policy, Development Policy at Amazon, and we appreciate her joining us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Again, in 2025, Amazon spending a record amount of money to invest in the United States. But we'll turn back more to that hot conflict in the Middle East we were just discussing when General Frank McKenzie joins us next right here on Bloomberg. Of course, it's not just any Wednesday. It is day 5 of the war in Iran. It is also the day after primary day, the first one here in the United States in this midterm election cycle. We're balancing 2 big stories at once. We will have more on the ongoing war when former U.S. CENTCOM Commander General Frank McKenzie joins us in just a moment. But we also do want to touch on Texas, because apparently it's on President Trump's mind today as well. Yesterday, conclusive victory for James Tallarico in the Democratic primary. The Texas state rep, devout Christian, seen as a rising star within the party, will be advancing to the race in November. We do not yet know, though, on the Republican side, who he'll be up against, as the race is going to a runoff, as neither Attorney General Ken Paxton or incumbent Republican Senator John Cornyn could secure enough votes yesterday. And President Trump apparently doesn't like that outcome, or at the very least, he's tired of this game, because he says he'll be bringing an endorsement in this race soon and is hoping that whoever he doesn't endorse will drop out immediately. For more, we turn to Bloomberg Texas Bureau Chief Julie Fine. So, Julie, of course, the president did not endorse in advance of the first primary vote, but I guess now, as we look forward to this May runoff, he's changing his mind on that.
Yeah, well, he can also be looking at how much money was spent in the primary alone. And if that is spent in this runoff election, you're going to lose a lot of money from a lot of other races. What he did today was interesting. He basically put it out there that he is going to endorse in this race and that he's hopeful that the other candidate will drop out of the race. If this other candidate doesn't drop out of the race, then the base may look at it and say, well, the president asked you to drop out of the race. It really puts the person that he doesn't endorse in a very interesting position, because they now have a decision to make. Are they going to do what the president asked, or are they going to go ahead with this runoff that, again, will be extremely expensive for the party, Kaylee?
Well, and Julie, how much of this is due to the fact that Republicans were hoping it was going to be Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett who ultimately advanced to the general election, who, of course, is not. Instead, it's James Tallarico.
And not only did she not advance, Kaylee, James Tallarico won fairly handily last night, or I should say in the early hours. So obviously there were some Republicans that felt that Crockett would be much easier to beat in a general election. So again, the president finally said today, or somebody said to him, you really need to get involved in that race. He made this decision. What I found very interesting about that tweet is, while he said he was going to endorse, he said soon. Does soon mean an hour? Does soon mean in a couple of days? Does soon mean he's negotiating with one candidate to get out of the race? We're going to find out in I would imagine in the next few days, weeks, hours. He just has to decide when he wants to make that decision.
All right, Bloomberg Texas Bureau Chief Julie Fine, thank you so much. Great coverage from Julie and the team there over the last several days. It's been a long few days for them, just as it's been a long few days for all of us who are covering the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. It is the subject right now in the White House press briefing, where the press secretary Caroline Leavitt is speaking to reporters, saying at this time, ground troops are not part of the plan for operations in Iran. But of course, the question is, could they become part of the plan, as all administration officials, including the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, are suggesting that this conflict is not yet near being over.
As President Trump said, more and larger waves are coming. We are just getting started. We are accelerating, not decelerating. Iran's capabilities are evaporating by the hour, while American strength grows fiercer, smarter, and utterly dominant. 4 days in, we have only just begun to fight. America fights to win. And in Operation Epic Fury, we are.
And joining us now with his insight is someone familiar with Americans' fighting capability and fighting in this region in particular. Former U.S. CENTCOM Commander General Frank McKenzie is with us now here on Bloomberg TV and radio. He's now Executive Director of the University of South Florida's Global and National Security Institute. General, thank you so much for being with us. You have recently penned an op-ed in the New York Times that ran on Sunday entitled "Iran Got Trump All Wrong." In it, you write, on the so-called escalation ladder, the concept war planners have used for decades to evaluate how conflict might evolve, Iran still has options, but they are at the low end. At the high end of the escalation ladder, all of the options are ours. So, General, now that we're 5 days into this conflict, what options do you see us having that we have not yet chosen to act on?
Well, Kaylee, first of all, good to be with you here this afternoon. We're in execution of a plan that's been refined for many years by United States Central Command. And what we're seeing right now is the complete establishment of air dominance over all of Iran, which will then allow us to strike Iranian ballistic missiles, drones, and cruise missiles with a lot more efficiency and effectiveness. You've got to take out their air defense in order to do that. That's largely been done, probably a little bit left, but we're working on that now. It will allow us to use non-smart weapons, weapons that don't require a big standoff range to drop against these targets. The plan, I think, is unfolding about as well as any CENTCOM commander would like to see. Now, there will be some surprises, undoubtedly, because war is the province of chance, but I believe we're on plan as we move forward.
Well, and when we consider the movement forward, can we continue to do so, to strike this many targets, to do it at this cadence indefinitely, as right now the Pentagon and the president are suggesting?
I think we can continue to do it until Iran recognizes that it's in their best interest to come to the table. And when we sit down at that table, it should not be as equals. It should be as victor and vanquished.
Well, if and when we get to that point, General, even if the U.S. accomplishes the entirety of what it said its objectives are with this operation in Iran, if it is no longer a threat from a ballistic missile standpoint or from a nuclear standpoint, clearly we will have expended a great deal of resources to do so, including from a munitions standpoint. And we can't just snap our fingers and get those assets back and reloaded and replenished. General, are you concerned about us being in a weaker strategic position, if not in the Middle East, specifically as it comes to Iran, when we consider the theaters elsewhere around the world that we may need to have those things in store for?
So the Joint Staff and the Secretary balance the global magazine for the United States. This is not a new problem. We've known for a couple of years now that our arsenal needs to be bigger, it needs to be deeper, because of decisions that were made across successive administrations going back to the early 1990s. We do need to reestablish parts of the defense industrial base, and I believe the Department of War is acting to do that right now.
And speaking of right now, we are getting headlines out from the White House press secretary's briefing, Caroline Leavitt, with the press, who has just said that Trump has spoken with Kurdish leaders about a base in Iraq. He has not agreed on a plan to arm Kurdish forces, as there's been reporting about in the last few days. In general, given your former perch as commander at CENTCOM, I wonder if you have an opinion as to whether arming Kurdish forces is a good idea, what that could mean if he were to make that decision.
I think we should seek a variety of ways to put pressure on the Iranian regime. Certainly, arming forces on the ground is one of those ways that we could do it. And I would hope that we're exploring all of those ways to put additional pressure on them. So I think it's certainly worth taking a good hard look at.
Well, and this brings me to the other idea that this isn't necessarily just going to be strictly U.S. and Israeli military against Iran and the IRGC, that Iran also has this vast proxy network to consider here as well. And we know Israel and Hezbollah have been exchanging fire in Lebanon. How concerned are you by the proxy aspect here and the perhaps unpredictable nature of that component of this?
Always concerned about Iran's proxy network. Their global terror network, which is perhaps a better and more direct way to describe it, is certainly a weapon they have. They're probably trying to energize it now. Of course, Lebanese Hezbollah, one of their premier proxy terror networks, has been largely eviscerated by Israel over the past year or so. And I think Israel's now redoubling their attacks on them. We should worry about the potential of attacks in this country by Iran. Although they have a bad track record of success in doing it, we know it remains an aspiration for them to carry out those attacks. This is not an easy country for them to operate in, and I know we're taking all the measures we need to in order to be prepared for that. I worry more, frankly, about attacks in the region against our friends and partners in the region. Iran's already attacked them directly with ballistic missiles, drones, and cruise missiles, so I'm certain they're going to use other methods to attack those countries as well. Although I would note that Iran's decision to engage countries like UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Qatar by attacking them directly, I believe ultimately is going to prove to be a profound strategic mistake for Iran.
Well, when we consider the proxy network, we, of course, have seen one of their proxies, the Houthis, already in just recent years having a very disruptive effect when it comes to global shipping in the Red Sea specifically. And the U.S. military was struggling to a large degree in order to make sure that waterway was secure and to kind of combat the Houthis' efforts. Now we're having a very similar conversation about the Strait of Hormuz. The president, as I'm sure you well know, General, has suggested the U.S. will provide insurance, even naval escorts, if necessary, in order to guarantee the safe passage of tankers and vessels through the strait. How difficult from an operations standpoint, is that going to be for the United States Navy? And how many resources could we actually expend just on that effort, separate to the actual operations in Iran itself?
Sure. So I'm glad to see that U.S. Central Command under Admiral Brad Cooper have already undertaken some pretty significant steps to reduce Iranian naval capability. I don't know the count right now, but it's certainly over 20 ships sunk. At the same time, we're striking, I am certain, where Iran stores its mines, the mines that they can deploy into the Strait of Hormuz to make it difficult for ships to go through. So we're probably working very hard right now to reduce those stocks and make it hard for Iran to actually implement that part of their plan. The other part of their plan will be their vast armada of small craft that can get out into the Gulf and into the Strait of Hormuz and interfere with shipping. We're going after them right now. What you'd like to do is prevent this from becoming a problem. Don't let these forces operate. Don't let them drop mines, because it's always harder to sweep the mines than it is to destroy the mines while they're still in their storage areas. We're very much aware of this problem. The U.S. Navy is very much aware of this problem. The Navy has trained for years to reopen these channels should it become necessary to do so. And I know that CENTCOM is giving it a great deal of attention right now.
Well, we so appreciate your expertise on this live situation. And finally, General, before we let you go, I do wonder your take on what happens when this is no longer an active situation, when we've reached the end game, whatever that may be. This is something I got into last night on Balance of Power with Israel's ambassador to the UN, Danny Danon. This is what he told me.
First, we are focused on degrading the capabilities, making sure there is no threat to Israel, to the region, to the world. And in the long run, we believe that there will be a new leadership that will be the responsibility for the Iranian people to choose. But we will create the conditions for them to actually take control of their future. Once we will create those conditions, the Iranian people will have to step up and actually choose their own leadership.
General, could creating those conditions actually require that this not just be an aerial campaign, but that the U.S. might need to put boots on the ground in Iran?
Well, I wouldn't claim to know that. I would think it would be wise for us not to leave any option off the table, and I think that's pretty much our stated position. I do agree that what we would like is a different form of government in Iran. That may be hard to get to, but that's where you want to go. Our track record of predicting the fall of regimes like this has been poor. No one saw the fall of Bashar Assad in Syria coming until 2 or 3 days before it actually happened. And while this regime has ensconced itself pretty heavily by killing all the potential people who could come to lead, I still think there's a possibility.
Yeah. All right, General, thank you so much for joining us, and please stay in touch with us as this conflict continues to unfold. General Frank McKenzie, the former commander of U.S. Central Command, here with us on Balance of Power, and I'll have much more on the late edition of Balance of Power at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, right here on Bloomberg TV and Radio.